March 18, 1944. Somewhere over northern France, the German fighter pilot from Munich had encountered countless American bombers during his 3 years of combat. B-17s, B-24s, and even the new B-29s he had heard about, but this one looked different, stubby and almost unattractive compared to the sleek B-17 flying fortresses. His wingman's voice crackled through the radio, making fun of the pregnant duck approaching their sector. The American B-25 Mitchell bomber was flying alone, separated from its squadron, limping at 8,000 feet with one engine trailing smoke. Easy pickings for two Messerschmitt Bf-109s. The pilot from Munich grinned beneath his oxygen mask. Another kill for his tally. He had already downed 6 bombers, and this one looked like it would be the easiest yet. He waggled his wings to signal his wingman, then pushed the stick forward, diving from 12,000 feet. The American bomber appeared larger in his sights. Oddly, the nose looked different from the other bombers he had attacked. Instead of the usual glass cockpit for the Bombardier, this one had a solid olive-drab nose. Several dark holes dotted the nose cone, gun ports, he realized. But how many guns could they possibly fit in that small space? Lieutenant Jack Morrison, from Akron, Ohio, watched the 2 German fighters diving at them through his top turret. He was 26 years old, married for 14 months, and had a baby girl he had never met except in photographs. The B-25J Mitchell they were flying had been modified in ways the Germans hadn't encountered. The U.S. Army Air Forces had learned hard lessons in Europe. Bomber crews needed more firepower, especially to defend against head-on attacks. So, they had made a drastic change. They removed the Bombardier's position and packed the nose full of machine guns. Not just 2, 4, or even 8, but 12 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns, plus 2 more on each side of the fuselage. Morrison keyed the intercom. The pilot, Captain Bill Anderson from Cedar Rapids, had already seen the enemy fighters. So had Sergeant Tony Russo from Brooklyn manning the nose guns. Russo, 22, a former butcher's apprentice with steady hands, now gripped the controls for 12 synchronized machine guns, each capable of firing 800 rounds per minute. Do the math. 9,600 rounds per minute of half-inch lead projectiles, all converging at a point 300 yards ahead of the aircraft. The German pilot from Munich had performed this kind of attack dozens of times. Dive from above, approach fast at a 15-degree angle, fire a burst at 500 yards, and break away at 200 yards. The closing speed would be over 500 miles per hour, too fast for the bomber's gunners to track effectively. He'd seen American gunners panic, spraying bullets into empty space. This attack would be no different. At 800 yards, he lined up his approach. The bomber hadn't changed course. Good. They were frozen with fear. At 600 yards, he prepared to pull the trigger. Then something odd happened. Small flashes of light began to appear from the bomber's nose. Not 2 or 4, but a series of muzzle flashes. Suddenly, the air in front of him turned solid. That's the only way to describe what 12 synchronized .50 caliber machine guns do to the space ahead of them. The tracer rounds, every 5th bullet, created lines of light so dense that they appeared as a solid wall of orange fire. Between the visible tracers were 4 invisible rounds. The German pilot had perhaps half a second to comprehend this before the first rounds reached him. A .50 caliber bullet is half an inch in diameter and weighs about an ounce and a half. When it leaves the barrel, it's traveling at 2,900 feet per second. At 300 yards, it still has enough energy to punch through an inch of steel plate. The Messerschmitt's armor was designed to protect against .30 caliber rounds from defensive positions. Not this. The first burst hit the German fighter's engine. 3 rounds pierced the engine block at once. Oil sprayed across the windscreen. 2 more rounds shattered the propeller hub. Another round tore through the cockpit floor, missing the pilot's legs by inches. The engine seized instantly, and the propeller spun uselessly. The pilot from Munich knew when to cut his losses. He rolled the plane inverted in double-way, trailing black smoke, looking for a place to land. His wingman, observing from above, couldn't believe his eyes. The American bomber had created a deadly zone of fire extending 300 yards from its nose. Not scattered defensive fire, but a concentrated barrage that no fighter could survive. The wingman pulled up sharply, climbing back to altitude. He was done with this monster. Let someone else deal with it. In the B-25's nose compartment, Sergeant Russo watched as a German fighter dove away. His hands hadn't even started sweating yet. The entire engagement lasted maybe 4 seconds, 4 seconds of absolute concentrated firepower that had turned the predator into prey. The 12 guns had fired perhaps 800 rounds in total. They carried 4,000 rounds for the nose guns alone, plenty left for anyone else who wanted to try. The modification had been Captain Anderson's idea, inspired by a report from the Pacific, where B-25 had been used for low-level strafing attacks against Japanese ships. The idea was simple: remove the bombardier position, since there were already dedicated bombers for that role, and turn the Mitchell into a flying gunship. The nose could accommodate 850 caliber guns, plus 4 more inside cheek-mounted packages. Add 2 more guns in the top turret, 2 in the waist positions, and 2 in the tail, making it the ultimate aerial weapon. In the tail, the B-25 Mitchell was now equipped with 18 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns. Nothing in the Luftwaffe arsenal was designed to withstand that kind of concentrated firepower. Captain Bill Anderson quickly checked his instruments. The No. 2 engine was still struggling after taking flak damage over the target, but it would hold for now. They had gotten separated from their squadron during a German fighter attack near Rams, and now they were alone, attempting to make it back to England on 1.5 engines. The encounter with the 2 Messerschmitts would be reported, and within hours, every German fighter squadron in France would know about the B-25 with a solid nose and the deadly war lead. 3 days later, Major Klaus Steinberg from Hamburg was skeptical about the reports. He had been flying combat missions since the Battle of Britain, with over 200 sorties and 43 confirmed kills. He knew American bombers and their weaknesses. The report claimed that a single B-25 had driven off 2 experienced pilots using something called a solid nose gun package. Steinberg figured it was propaganda, or that the 2 pilots had been inexperienced, possibly frightened by a lucky burst of defensive fire. He was leading a flight of 4 Focke-Wulf 190s on patrol near Abbeville when they spotted a formation of American bombers returning from a raid on railroad yards in Belgium. Most of the bombers were B-26 Marauders, flying in their standard box formation at 15,000 feet. But trailing behind, lower and slower, was a single B-25. Steinberg smiled. This would be a good opportunity to show the younger pilots how to properly attack a wounded bomber. The Mitchell was flying at 12,000 feet, both engines running but struggling to maintain altitude. Steinberg could see the tail number and the olive drab paint worn down from hundreds of hours of combat. The crew had to be exhausted, probably low on ammunition after their bombing run. He signaled his flight. He would attack first from the front quarter, demonstrate the proper technique, and then the others could finish it off. Staff Sergeant Ray Kowalski from Pittsburgh was manning the top turret, constantly scanning the sky. At 24 years old and built like a linebacker, Kowalski had worked in steel mills before enlisting. He had been flying combat missions for 8 months and had seen friends' planes explode and crews floating down in parachutes over enemy territory. He knew the statistics. The average life expectancy for a bomber crew was only 15 missions. They were on their 31st. He spotted the 4 German fighters high and to the right, about 3 miles away, climbing for altitude. The sick feeling in his stomach had nothing to do with turbulence, for fighters against one damaged bomber rarely ended well. But their B-25J wasn't just any bomber. They'd proven that over and over in the past 2 months. The modifications had turned them from prey into something else. Still not a predator, but certainly not an easy target. Captain Mike Thompson, 31, from Denver was flying this mission. He was Anderson's regular replacement when Anderson was on leave. Thompson had been a crop duster before the war, with hands like a surgeon and nerves of steel. When Kowalski reported the fighters, Thompson's voice over the intercom was calm, like he was discussing the weather. He told the nose gunner, Corporal Jim Sullivan from Boston, to ready the nose battery. Sullivan, just 19, was the youngest man on the crew but had the reflexes to make him deadly on the gun controls. Major Steinberg began his attack from 2 o'clock high, the classic position that gave him speed and angle, making it difficult for the bomber's guns to track. He approached at a 30-degree angle, planning to fire his cannons at 400 yards and then break away. The Focke-Wulf's 4 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns were more than enough to tear the Mitchell apart. He pushed the stick forward, entering a shallow dive, accelerating to 300 miles per hour, 350, then 400. The bomber loomed large in his windscreen. At 1,000 yards, he saw the Mitchell's nose, solid, just like the report had said. Multiple gun ports were visible. So the story was true. They had modified the nose, but no matter, even 8 machine guns couldn't stop a well-executed fighter attack. At 600 yards, he prepared to fire, but that's when Sullivan opened up. The sensation was like flying into a thunderstorm made of lead. The tracer rounds created a tunnel of light that Steinberg felt he was flying directly into. His windscreen shattered in 5 places. Something hammered into his left wing, then his right. The control stick shook violently in his hands. A round punched through the canopy, showering him with plexiglass. Another destroyed his gun sight. 2 more rounds hit the engine, and immediately he smelled smoke. Training took over. Steinberg rolled hard left, diving away from the onslaught of fire. In his entire combat career, he had never experienced anything like this. The American bomber had turned the air in front of it into a killing zone. His Focke-Wulf had taken at least a dozen hits in less than 2 seconds. Oil pressure dropped, engine temperature soared, and smoke filled the cockpit. He jettisoned the canopy and prepared to bail out. The 3 remaining German fighters watched their leader fall away, trailing smoke and flames. Steinberg's parachute blossomed white against the green French countryside below. The wingman, a young lieutenant from Berlin on his 5th combat mission, felt his mouth go dry. He had been taught that American bombers were vulnerable. But what he had just witnessed was something else entirely. The B-25 had proven itself a monster, capable of creating a wall of fire that no fighter could survive. The lieutenant hesitated, knowing his attack would be no different than Steinberg's. Fear gripped him, and he pulled back on his stick, unwilling to face the same fate. The B-25 Mitchell's 18 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns turned it into a fortress in the sky. Nothing in the Luftwaffe arsenal could withstand that kind of firepower. Captain Mike Thompson kept the bomber steady, watching the 3 remaining German fighters circling at a safe distance. They were staying out of effective gun range, probably debating their next move. Thompson knew they would try again. German pilots were relentless, but this time they'd be more cautious. They'd likely coordinate an attack from multiple angles. That was fine. This B-25 had guns pointing in every direction. Let them come. The Germans did exactly as Thompson expected. They split up, each climbing to different altitudes of position for a coordinated attack. 1 high, 1 level, 1 low. The tactic was effective against standard bombers, overwhelming the defenses and forcing the gunners to choose targets. But this was no standard bomber. The Mitchell's nose gun could handle multiple targets in rapid succession, and the top turret, waist guns, and tail position were fully manned. The 3 German fighters converged, attacking from different directions. Sullivan, the nose gunner, engaged the high fighter first, sending a stream of lead into its path. The German pilot broke off early, narrowly avoiding the tracers. Kowalski, manning the top turret, opened fire on the level fighter, his twin .50s hammering away. Sergeant Paul Martinez, the waist gunner, took on the low fighter. For 15 seconds, the air around the B-25 was filled with crossing tracers, the bomb at the center of a deadly web. When it was over, all 3 German fighters disengaged. One was trailing smoke, another had its windscreen shattered, barely able to see. They had managed to put maybe 20 rounds into the B-25, mostly small caliber, doing no significant damage. The bomber had fired over 2,000 rounds and was still flying, still dangerous. Without a word, the 3 German pilots turned east and headed home. They weren't going to challenge this flying fortress of guns any longer. Word spread quickly through the Luftwaffe. The Americans had created a monster, a bomber that could defend itself with unprecedented firepower. Within a week, standing orders were issued. B-25s with solid noses were to be engaged only with superior numbers and extreme caution. Better to let them pass than risk losing fighters to that wall of lead. But not everyone got the message, or chose to believe it. Lieutenant Friedrich Weber from Stuttgart, 22 years old, and with only 3 months of combat experience, had yet to score a kill. When he spotted a lone B-25 over Normandy on April 2nd, 1944, he saw an opportunity. His flight leader had warned him about the modified Mitchells, but Weber figured the stories were exaggerated. No bomber could carry that much firepower, right? He peeled off from his formation and dubbed to attack. Technical Sergeant Joe Novak from Cleveland was manning the nose guns that day. At 27 years old, Novak had been a machinist before the war and understood mechanical systems like few others. He had personally supervised the installation and alignment of the 12 nose guns, ensuring their convergence at exactly 350 yards. He had even painted a sign above his gun position, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here." Novak watched as a young German pilot began his run. He could tell by the approach. The attack was too steep, too fast, with no deception. The kid was eager for an easy kill. Novak almost felt sorry for him. Almost. When the fighter was 400 yards away, Novak squeezed the trigger. The 12 guns roared in unison, sending a devastating stream that led directly into the path of the German fighter. Weber had maybe a quarter of a second to realize his fatal mistake. The concentrated fire tore his Messerschmitt apart like paper. The left wing detached first, then the tail, followed by the engine explosion. The cockpit disintegrated. What had once been a fighter plane was now a cloud of wreckage falling toward the French countryside. Weber never had a chance to bail out. Captain Anderson, back from leave and flying that mission, watched the destruction in his mirror. He had seen the nose guns in action many times, but it still amazed him. 12.50 caliber machine guns firing simultaneously created a level of firepower that seemed better suited for a naval vessel than an aircraft. Each gun was precisely aligned, and their combined rate of fire created a stream of bullets so dense that nothing could survive flying through it. The modifications had transformed the B-25 from a medium bomber into something entirely new, a gunship that happened to carry bombs. The changes hadn't come without cost. The 12 nose guns and their ammunition added over 2,000 pounds to the aircraft's weight. The Mitchell's bomb load had to be reduced, and fuel consumption increased. The guns generated so much heat when fired that special ventilation had to be installed to prevent the nose compartment from becoming unbearably hot. The recoil from all 12 guns firing could even slow the bomber's airspeed by 10 miles per hour. But none of that mattered when you could create a wall of lead that no fighter pilot would dare challenge. By May 1944, the modified B-25J had become legendary among both American and German pilots. American fighter escorts would deliberately leave gaps in their coverage around the gunship Mitchells, knowing they could take care of themselves without help. German pilots quickly learned that the B-25 with a solid nose was no longer just another bomber. They were now a formidable force to be reckoned with. In fact, they became so feared that German pilots would often radio warnings when they spotted these gunship variants, opting for easier targets instead. The kill ratio was staggering. In just 3 months of operations, the B-25JS had downed or damaged over 40 German fighters while losing only 2 of their own. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hoffman from Milwaukee, commanding the 447th Bombardment Squadron, recognized the potential of these modified B-25s and pushed hard for more conversions. In his report to the 8th Air Force Headquarters, he was blunt. The B-25J gunship configuration has proven that the best defense is overwhelming offense. German pilots have learned to fear these aircraft. I request the immediate conversion of all available B-25s to gunship configuration. However, his request was denied. The modifications were costly and time-consuming, and the added weight negatively impacted range and bomb load. The Army Air Forces needed bombers that could deliver bombs, not just gunships. Despite this, Hoffman's squadron kept their modified Mitchells and continued to demonstrate their worth on every mission. On May 15, 1944, over the Pied de Colle, Captain Ernst Müller from Cologne led a squadron of 12 Messerschmitt Bf-109s. These were seasoned pilots with multiple kills. They had been vectored to intercept a formation of American bombers heading toward V-1 launch sites along the French coast. Müller, with 38 confirmed kills and known as one of the Luftwaffe's best bomber hunters, had read the reports about the modified B-25s. He believed the threat was real but manageable with the right tactics. The American formation appeared through broken clouds at 14,000 feet. The B-26 Marauders led the formation, with B-25s trailing behind. Müller studied the bombers through his binoculars and identified 3 solid-nose variants among the regular Mitchells. He made his plan, ignore the gunships and focus on the standard bombers and Marauders. No need to engage the flying fortresses of guns when easier targets were available. Sergeant Danny O'Brien from South Boston, manning the nose guns in one of the B-25JS, had other plans. O'Brien, 23 years old with red hair and freckles, had a temperament that matched his Boston roots, always ready to hit first and hit hard. When he saw the German fighters positioning to attack the other bombers, he was offended. They were treating him and his Mitchell as unworthy of attention. He was determined to show them otherwise. O'Brien convinced his pilot, Lieutenant Tom Washington from Tallahassee, to break formation slightly and angle toward the German fighters. Not exactly an attack run, but positioning the B-25 to put the Germans within range of the nose guns if they came after the other bombers. Washington, 28, a former math teacher who understood angles and vectors, agreed. They could provide covering fire for the other bombers, using their massive firepower defensively. Muller noticed the B-25 edging out of formation, but didn't immediately understand why. When he led his fighters in against a group of standard Mitchells, he found out. O'Brien opened fire at maximum range, 800 yards, walking his streams of tracers across the path of the approaching German fighters. The Germans had never expected to take fire from a bomber that wasn't even being attacked. The psychological effect was immediate. Seeing that wall of lead reaching toward them caused 3 pilots to break off their attacks prematurely. One German pilot, younger and more aggressive, pressed on, determined to make the kill. As he closed in, O'Brien shifted his fire, all 12 guns swiveling to track the fighter. At 500 yards, the accuracy improved. The round began to strike the Messerschmitt. Not many at first, but enough to get the pilot's attention. By 400 yards, the fighter was taking multiple hits. The German pilot broke off and dove away, smoke streaming from his engine. He had never even gotten within effective firing range of his target. The entire engagement lasted less than a minute, but had a lasting effect. Muller realized that the Americans had turned these gunship B-25s into aerial destroyers, able to protect the bomber formation the way naval destroyers protected convoys. They didn't have to wait for an attack. They could initiate the fight, reaching out and striking any fighter that threatened the formation. The 12 nose guns gave the B-25 a reach and hitting power that no fighter pilot was willing to test. 3 days later, the Luftwaffe issued new tactical guidelines. B-25 with solid noses were now classified as heavy defensive platforms, to be engaged only when absolutely necessary. The preferred tactic was to avoid them altogether, focusing on other targets. If engagement was unavoidable, attack should be made from directly above or below, outside the cone of fire from the nose guns. Even then, pilots were warned to expect heavy defensive fire from other positions. But the Americans didn't stop improving. The gunship Mitchells began flying in specific positions within formations, placed where their nose guns could cover the maximum number of other bombers. They became the shepherds of the bomber fleet, the guardians keeping the wolves at bay. German pilots soon learned to recognize them from miles away. That distinctive solid nose became a warning sign that read, "Find another target." Staff Sergeant Frank Rodriguez from El Paso had a different job on the B-25J. As a flight engineer, Staff Sergeant Frank Rodriguez, a 25-year-old mechanic from El Paso, was responsible for keeping the B-25 guns running smoothly. Before the war, he had worked in his father's garage, gaining a knack for mechanical systems. The 12 nose guns were temperamental, prone to jamming if not meticulously maintained. Each gun fired at slightly different rates, which could create harmonic vibrations, shaking mountings loose. The heat from sustained firing could warp barrels, cause ammunition to cook off, or even ignite fires if hydraulic fluid leaked onto hot metal. Rodriguez had developed a maintenance routine that bordered on obsessive. After every mission, he cleaned and checked each gun, inspected the ammunition belt for damaged rounds, and adjusted the gun mountings daily to compensate for the metal fatigue caused by vibration. He even created a firing sequence to prevent overheating. Fire 8 guns for 3 seconds, then switch to the remaining 4, allowing the first set to cool before switching back for the kill shot. Rodriguez's careful attention paid off on May 28, 1944, when they encountered something new, a full squadron of Focke-Wulf 190 specifically hunting for the B-25 gunship variants. The Germans had developed new tactics, approaching in wave from multiple angles, trying to overwhelm the B-25's defensive firepower. The first wave came in high and fast, for fighters in trail formation. O'Brien engaged them at maximum range, forcing them to adjust their approach. But while the nose guns were occupied, another 4 fighters attacked from the beam positions. This is where the B-25J's full armament came into play. While O'Brien handled the high attackers, the top turret gunner, Sergeant Mike Patterson from Detroit, engaged the beam attackers with his twin .50s. The waist gunners, Corporal Tim Lee from San Francisco and Corporal Bobby Jackson from Atlanta, added their fire, while tail gunner Sergeant Mario Benedetti from Newark watched for any threats from behind. The Mitchell became a sphere of flying lead, guns firing in every direction. The German fighters pressed their attacks with determination, but the volume of defensive fire was overwhelming. One Focke-Wulf took a burst from the nose guns that tore off most of its right wing. Another had its cockpit shattered by fire from the top turret. A third pulled away, both engines on fire, after flying through the combined fire from both waist positions. In 90 seconds of combat, the B-25 had shot down 2 fighters and damaged 3 more, while taking only minor damage itself. But the Germans were adapting too. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, while the world focused on the beaches of Normandy, Captain Hans Richter from Vienna led an experimental attack against a gunship B-25. He had studied every after-action report, analyzed the geometry of the nose gun coverage, and identified what he believed to be a blind spot. If approached from directly below at a 70 degrees angle, the nose guns couldn't depress enough to engage the fighter. The belly of the B-25 was relatively undefended, with no gun positions covering that angle. Richter's theory was tested over Caen. He spotted a lone B-25J struggling back from a mission, one engine feathered, falling behind his formation. It was a perfect target to test his approach. He dove below the bomber's altitude, then pulled up sharply from directly underneath. The nose guns couldn't bear on him, the top turret couldn't depress that far, and the waist guns had limited downward visibility. For a few seconds, he had a clear shot at the bomber's belly. His cannon shells tore into the Mitchell's underside, puncturing fuel tanks and severing control cables. The bomber shuddered, began losing altitude, but Richter pulled away, expecting to see it go down. However, the crew of the B-25 wasn't ready to quit. Lieutenant Colonel James Foster, 42 years old and the oldest pilot in the squadron, was flying that day. He had more flight hours than most pilots had in their lifetimes. He felt the hits and knew they were bad, but he also knew B-25s were tough birds. Despite losing rudder control, with fuel streaming from punctured tanks and the remaining engine overheating, Foster managed to keep the Mitchell in the air through skill and sheer determination. They were only 40 miles from the emergency field at Tangmei. He ordered the crew to prepare for a crash landing while he nursed the bomber home. O'Brien stayed at the nose guns, ready to discourage any fighter that might try to finish them off. Rodriguez worked frantically to transfer fuel from the punctured tanks, trying to prevent a fire. They made it to Tangmei on fumes and prayers. Foster brought the Mitchell in hot, no flaps, no rudder. Using differential engine power and aileron to maintain control flight, they hit hard, bounced twice, and ground looped when the left gear collapsed. They came to rest in a cloud of dust and smoke. The crew evacuated quickly, expecting fire, but Rodriguez's fuel transfer had worked. They all walked away. The Mitchell was written off, but it had survived an attack that should have destroyed it, bringing its crew home against impossible odds. Richter's report on the successful attack method spread quickly through the Luftwaffe, but it came with a warning. The attack required perfect execution and iron nerves. You had to fly directly under the bomber's guns, trust that you were in the blind spot, pull up at exactly the right angle, and score hits in the few seconds before the bomber's gunners adjusted. Most pilots who tried it found that the defensive fire from the B-25s was simply too overwhelming to survive. By July 1944, the gunship B-25s had become legendary within the 8th Air Force, with crews requesting assignment to them despite the reduced bomb load. Fighter escorts would often radio greetings when they spotted the distinctive solid noses, and ground crews painted elaborate nose art celebrating their immense firepower, dragons breathing lead, Gatling guns with wings, the Grim Reaper holding a dozen sides. One Mitchell, named Leadstorm, had 43 small German crosses painted below. The cockpit, each one representing a fighter destroyed or damaged by its guns. The German pilots had their own nickname for them, Hollandmaskinen, or Hell machines. Luftwaffe intelligence estimated that engaging a gunship B-25 head-on was 12 times more dangerous than attacking a standard B-17 from the same angle. The mathematics was simple yet brutal. A B-17's nose had 2.50 caliber guns, maybe 4 if you counted the top turret's forward-facing guns. The B-25J had 14 guns capable of firing forward, the 12 in the nose plus the top turret, which was 7 times the firepower, and it was all concentrated in a much tighter arc. But beyond the numbers was the psychological impact. Sergeant Willie Turner from Birmingham, the tail gunner on a B-25J called Alabama Hammer, described it best in a letter home. He was 21 and had been a coal miner before the war, so he knew all about danger and fear. "The German fighters are afraid of us now," he wrote. "You can see it in how they fly. They come in all aggressive, then they see our nose, see all those gun barrels, and they hesitate. That hesitation is all we need. Danny opens up with the nose guns, and suddenly the fighter is running away, not even trying to shoot back. We become the thing they check for before attacking anyone else." The fear was justified. On July 18, 1944, a single B-25J shot down 4 German fighters in one mission. The bomber, nicknamed Seattle Slugger, was flown by Major Robert Chen from San Francisco, one of the few Chinese-American pilots in the European theater. His nose gunner, Sergeant Bill Garrett from Louisville, had developed an almost supernatural ability to lead targets. The 4 kills came in 2 separate engagements, each time with German fighters testing whether the gunship's reputation was deserved. The first 2 were Bf-109s that attempted a coordinated attack from 1 o'clock high. Garrett engaged the lead fighter at 600 yards, walking his tracers into its path. The German pilot, seeing the wall of lead coming, tried to roll away but flew directly into the stream. The concentrated fire tore through the fighter's fuselage just behind the cockpit. The tail section detached completely, and the rest of the aircraft tumbled out of control. The second 109, witnessing his leader's destruction, broke off without firing a shot, but made the mistake of crossing in front of the B-25. Garrett smoothly shifted his fire, catching the fighter broadside. 12.50 caliber guns at 300 yards turned the Messerschmitt into scrap metal in less than 2 seconds. The second engagement came near the target, railway yards at Amy. 2 Focke-Wulf 190s bounced the formation from above, diving through the top cover. One lined up on Seattle Slugger, probably not recognizing it as a gunship variant until it was too late. Garrett opened fire at maximum range, creating his signature wall of lead. The German pilot, committed to his dive, tried to barrel through 500 yards, 400, 300. The tracers were now hitting, sparking off the fighter's engine, cowling, and shattering the canopy. At 200 yards, the Focke-Wulf's engine exploded. The pilot bailed out, his parachute opening just as his fighter plowed into a French wheat field. The 4th kill was almost accidental. A damaged 109 trying to disengage from another bomber flew across Seattle Slugger's nose at about 400 yards. Garrett fired a short burst, more of a warning than an attack. But with 12 guns firing, even a short burst meant 200 rounds. The fighter took at least 20 hits, began streaming glycol from its cooling system, and the pilot immediately dove for the deck, looking for somewhere to land. He didn't make it. The engine seized 2 miles later, forcing him to bail out at low altitude. His parachute barely had time to deploy. Major Chen's after-action report was matter-of-fact. Engaged enemy fighters, for destroyed, no damage to aircraft, returning to base. But the impact rippled through both air forces. 4 kills by a single bomber in one mission was almost unheard of. The gunship B-25s were no longer just defending themselves. They were actively hunting fighters that came too close. The Luftwaffe response was to essentially declare the gunship B-25s off-limits unless absolutely necessary. A directive dated July 22, 1944, instructed fighter pilots to avoid engaging B-25s with a solid-nose configuration unless specifically ordered to or when no alternative targets were available. It was an admission of defeat, acknowledging that some American bombers were simply too dangerous to attack. But war doesn't always allow for choosing your battles. On August 3, 1944, Lieutenant Wolfgang Becker from Dusseldorf found himself alone, separated from his squadron, low on fuel, with a B-25J directly in his path back to base. Becker, 20 years old and on his 8th combat mission, had never encountered a gunship Mitchell before. He'd heard the stories, but he figured he had no choice. He needed to get past the bomber to reach his airfield. Maybe he could dash underneath it, avoiding those famous nose guns. Corporal Johnny Washington from Memphis was manning the nose guns that day, substituting for the usual nose gunner. By late July 1944, the B-25 gunships had become a key part of the 8th Air Force's mythology. Crews eagerly volunteered for assignments to these planes despite the reduced bomb load. Fighter escorts often greeted them over the radio when they spotted the distinct solid noses. Ground crews adorned the bombers with intricate nose art, celebrating their fearsome firepower, dragons breathing fire, Gatling guns with wings, and the Grim Reaper holding a dozen sides. One Mitchell, Lead Storm, proudly displayed 43 small German crosses beneath its cockpit, each representing a fighter it had destroyed or damaged. The Luftwaffe pilots had their own nickname for the B-25s, Holland Maskinen, or Hell Machines. Luftwaffe intelligence estimated that engaging a gunship B-25 head-on was 12 times more dangerous than attacking a B-17 from the same angle. The math was clear. A B-17's nose featured only 2.50 caliber guns, maybe 4 if you included the top turret's forward-facing weapons. Meanwhile, the B-25J had 14 forward-firing guns, 12 in the nose and the top turret, 7 times the firepower, all concentrated in a much tighter arc. But beyond the numbers was the psychological effect. Sergeant Willie Turner from Birmingham, the tail gunner on Alabama Hammer, described it best in a letter home. He was 21 and had worked as a coal miner before the war, so he was no stranger to danger. "The German fighters are afraid of us now," he wrote. "You can see it in how they fly. They come in all aggressive, but when they see our nose, all those gun barrels, they hesitate. That hesitation is all we need." Danny opens up with the nose guns, and suddenly the fighter is running away, not even trying to shoot back. We become the thing they check for before attacking anyone else. The fear was justified. On July 18, 1944, a single B-25J shot down 4 German fighters in one mission. The bomber, Seattle Slugger, was flown by Major Robert Chen from San Francisco, one of the few Chinese-American pilots in the European theater. His nose gunner, Sergeant Bill Garrett from Louisville, had developed an almost supernatural ability to lead targets. The 4 kills came in 2 engagements, each time with German fighters testing whether the gunship's reputation was deserved. The first 2 were Bf-109s that attempted a coordinated attack from 1 o'clock high. Garrett engaged the lead fighter at 600 yards, walking his tracers into its path. The German pilot, seeing the wall of lead coming, tried to roll away but flew directly into the stream. The concentrated fire tore through the fighter's fuselage, and the tail section detached, sending the aircraft into a tumble. The second 109, witnessing the destruction of his leader, broke off without firing a shot but made the mistake of crossing in front of the B-25. Garrett smoothly shifted fire, catching the fighter broadside. 12.50 caliber guns at 300 yards turned the Messerschmitt into scrap metal in less than 2 seconds. The second engagement occurred near the target at the railway yards at Amy. 2 Focke-Wulf 190s bounced the formation from above, diving through the top cover. One lined up on Seattle Slugger, probably not recognizing it as a gunship until it was too late. Garrett opened fire at maximum range, creating his signature wall of lead. The German pilot, committed to his dive, tried to barrel through. By 500 yards, the tracers were hitting, sparking off the fighter's engine and cowling, and shattering the canopy. At 200 yards, the Focke-Wulf's engine exploded. The pilot bailed out, his parachute opening just as his fighter plowed into a French wheat field. The 4th kill was almost accidental. A damaged 109, trying to disengage from another bomber, flew across Seattle Slugger's nose at 400 yards. Garrett fired a short burst, more of a warning than an attack. But with 12 guns firing, even a short burst meant 200 rounds. The fighter took at least 20 hits, began streaming glycol from its cooling system, and the pilot immediately duffed the deck, looking for somewhere to land. He didn't make it. The engine seized 2 miles later, forcing him to bail out at low altitude. His parachute barely deployed. Major Chen's after-action report was brief. Engaged enemy fighters. For destroyed, no damage to aircraft, returning to base. The impact was felt in both air forces. 4 kills by a single bomber in one mission was almost unheard of. The gunship B-25s were no longer just defending themselves. They were actively hunting fighters that came too close. The Luftwaffe response was to declare the gunship B-25s off limits unless absolutely necessary. A directive dated July 22, 1944, instructed fighter pilots to avoid engaging B-25s with solid-nose configurations unless specifically ordered to or when no alternative targets were available. It was an admission of defeat, acknowledging that some American bombers were simply too dangerous to attack. However, war doesn't always allow for choosing your battles. On August 3, 1944, Lieutenant Wolfgang Becker from Dusseldorf found himself alone, separated from his squadron, low on fuel, and with a B-25J directly in his path back to base. Becker, 20 years old and on his 8th combat mission, had never encountered a gunship Mitchell before. He'd heard the stories but figured he had no choice. He needed to get past a bomber to reach his airfield. Maybe he could dash underneath it, avoiding those famous nose guns. Corporal Johnny Washington from Memphis, substituting for O'Brien, was manning the nose guns that day. Washington, a 19-year-old former saxophone player, had musician's hands, long, delicate fingers that could coax melodies from brass or, as he discovered, death from machine guns. He had an almost musical sense of timing, understanding rhythm, and lead in ways that couldn't be taught. Washington saw the lone German fighter approaching at low altitude, trying to slip underneath. He depressed the nose guns as far as they would go, but the angle was wrong. The fighter would pass below their field of fire. He called out to the pilot, Captain Steve Anderson from Portland. Without hesitation, Anderson pushed the Mitchell's nose down, diving to give Washington a better angle. It was a risky move, diving toward an enemy fighter, but it worked. The German fighter was no longer safely passing beneath them. It was now directly in the cone of fire from the nose guns. Washington opened up at 300 yards, all 12 guns roaring. The concentrated fire created a curtain of lead that the fighter flew directly into. Becker's Messerschmitt came apart like it had hit an invisible wall. The engines separated from the fuselage, both wings folded backward, and the cockpit disintegrated. What had been a fighter was now a cloud of debris falling into the English Channel. Becker never knew what hit him. The kill was Washington's first and only. 2 days later, after O'Brien returned to duty, Washington was transferred to another crew. But that one engagement earned him a Distinguished Flying Cross and a mention in Stars and Stripes. The headline read, Memphis Jazzman plays deadly tune on Nazi fighter, a story that further solidified the legendary status of the gunship Mitchells. By late August 1944, as the Allies advanced through France, the role of the B-25 gunships began to shift. With fewer German fighters challenging the bomber streams, the Mitchells were increasingly used for ground attack missions. The 12 nose guns, capable of destroying a fighter in seconds, proved equally effective against trucks, trains, and troop concentrations. The gunships would fly low, sometimes only 50 feet off the deck, and unleash their firepower on German columns trying to retreat eastward. Lieutenant David Kim from Los Angeles, flying a B-25J named Dragon's Breath, described one such mission in his diary. They intercepted a German convoy at a crossroads near Falls, with about 30 vehicles, including tanks and half-tracks. Kim brought the Mitchell in at treetop height while his nose gunner, Sergeant Carlos Mendoza from San Diego, prepared to engage. At 200 yards, Mendoza opened fire with all 12 guns. The effect was catastrophic. Trucks exploded, men scattered, and tank crews abandoned their vehicles rather than face that concentrated fire. In one pass, lasting maybe 10 seconds, they destroyed or damaged half the convoy. But the Germans were learning. They began positioning anti-aircraft guns specifically to target the low-flying gunships. On September 2, 1944, Hell's 12, a B-25J that had survived 43 missions, was caught by concentrated flak near Metz. The nose compartment, where Sergeant Tony Palmer from Chicago manned the 12 guns, took a direct hit from an 88mm shell. Palmer was killed instantly, and the nose guns were destroyed. Without their primary armament, the Mitchell was just another medium bomber, and a damaged one at that. Captain Ben Franklin from Philadelphia, the pilot, managed to bring the crippled bomber back to Allied territory, but Hell's 12 would never fly again. The loss hit the squadron hard. Every gunship crew knew they were priority targets. The Germans had placed bounties on them, promising extra lead to any anti-aircraft crew that brought one down. Fighter pilots who destroyed a gunship Mitchell were awarded immediate Iron Crosses. The solid-nose B-25s had become symbols, proof that American industrial might had created weapons the Germans could not effectively counter. But the gunships kept flying, kept fighting. On September 15, 1944, during the failed Operation Market Garden, B-25 gunships provided close air support for paratroopers trapped at Arnhem. Flying through intense ground fire, they came in at rooftop height, their nose guns oppressing German positions. Sergeant Mike O'Connor from Buffalo, nose gun on New York Minute, fired over 3,000 rounds in a single mission, helping clear a path for British paratroopers. The mission cost them. New York Minute took over 100 hits from small arms and light flak. O'Connor was wounded twice, but stayed at his guns. Major Tom Wilson from Seattle, the pilot, flew the last 30 minutes with no hydraulics, barely any control, and blood from his own wounds making the stick slippery. They made it back to base, counted the holes, and counted themselves lucky to be alive. Wilson received a Distinguished Flying Cross, and O'Connor spent 2 months in the hospital, but would return to flying. By October 1944, the Luftwaffe had largely been swept from the skies over Western Europe. The gunship B-25s had played a pivotal role in that victory. Official records credited them with 73 confirmed fighter kills and over 100 damaged. Unofficial estimates were even higher, but the numbers didn't tell the full story. The real victory was psychological. They had taken a bomber and turned it into something that fighters feared. They had reversed the predator-prey dynamic that had defined aerial combat. Captain Paul Anderson from Minnesota, who had flown 37 missions in a gunship Mitchell, wrote to his wife to explain the shift in tactics. "We changed the rules," he said. "For 3 years, fighters hunted bombers. We were always on the defensive, always reacting. Then we put 12 guns in the nose, and suddenly we weren't prey anymore. We were dangerous. We could reach out and touch them before they could touch us. You could see it in their eyes. Not that we could actually see their eyes, but you know what I mean. They'd come in all aggressive, and then they'd see our nose, see all those guns, and they'd hesitate. And in air combat, hesitation is death." The ground crews recognized the significance as well. Master Sergeant Roy White from Dallas, crew chief of Texas Thunder, had worked on bombers since 1942. He noticed a difference with the gunship Mitchells. Regular bombers, you're always patching holes, fixing damage from fighter attacks. But the gunships, they came back clean more often than not. The fighters just wouldn't engage them. And when they did, well, we'd be painting another kill mark on the nose instead of patching bullet holes. November 1944 brought new challenges. The Germans had introduced jet fighters, the Messerschmitt Me-262, which were 100 miles per hour faster than anything the Allies had. The conventional wisdom was that these jets were unstoppable and no amount of defensive firepower could counter their speed advantage. However, the gunship crews weren't convinced. On November 28, 1944, they got their chance to prove their worth. Captain Jack Thompson from Denver was flying Colorado Crusher on a mission to bomb rail yards near Frankfurt when two Me-262s appeared. The jets made a high-speed pass of the formation, their cannons blazing. Most of the bombers could only watch, unable to track the fast-moving jets, but Thompson had positioned his B-25 perfectly, anticipating the jet's attack path. Sergeant Pete Wilson from Portland, manning the nose guns, had maybe 2 seconds to engage. But with 12 guns, 2 seconds was more than enough. He led the target by what seemed like an impossible distance, firing where the jet would be rather than where it was. The wall of lead intersected perfectly with the Me-262's flight path. The jet flew through the concentrated fire for less than half a second, but that was enough. Multiple .50 caliber rounds struck the jet's right engine, and it began trailing smoke. Its speed advantage was gone. The pilot broke off, diving away, trying to make it back to base on one engine. He didn't make it, bailing out 10 miles short of his airfield. It was the first jet fighter damaged by a B-25 gunship, proving that even the newest German wonder weapons weren't immune to concentrated firepower. The second Me-262 wisely decided not to press its attack, disappearing into the clouds at 600 miles per hour. Wilson would later receive the Silver Star for his exceptional gunnery skills against superior enemy aircraft. In December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, German forces had broken through American lines in the Ardennes, and every available aircraft was thrown into the battle. The B-25 gunships were assigned close air support missions. Their firepower was desperately needed to stop German armored columns, flying in weather that would normally ground all aircraft. They came in low through snow and fog, their 12-nose guns tearing into German vehicles and troops. On December 23rd, when the weather cleared briefly, the full might of Allied air power was unleashed. Captain Bill Roberts from Houston led 3 gunship Mitchells against a German panzer column near Bastogne. They came in line astern, each B-25 firing its nose guns in sequence. The first Mitchell destroyed the lead vehicles, blocking the road. The second hit the fuel trucks in the middle of the column. Roberts, flying the third aircraft, worked over the trapped vehicles systematically. His nose gunner, Sergeant Jim Davis from Little Rock, fired over 4,000 rounds in 3 passes. By the end of the attack, 27 German vehicles were burning, and the column was completely destroyed. However, the Germans fought back fiercely. Anti-aircraft fire was intense and desperate. On Roberts' third pass, Houston Pride took massive damage. The nose compartment was hit repeatedly. Davis was wounded in both arms but kept firing, and the right engine was shot out. The left wing was on fire. Roberts managed to keep the Mitchell airborne long enough to reach American lines, then Bella landed it in a snow-covered field. The crew survived, but Davis would lose his left arm. Houston Pride was done. Another gunship lost to German desperation. By January 1945, the war in Europe was nearing its end. German resistance was crumbling, and their air force was virtually extinct. The B-25 gunships had done their job, perhaps too well. There were simply no more fighters to shoot down, and no more need for their specialized firepower. Some gunships were converted back to standard bomber configurations, while others were assigned to ground attack duties, using their 12-nose guns against targets of opportunity. On February 12, 1945, Brooklyn Brawler, flown by Lieutenant Sam Cohen from New York, encountered a lone Focke-Wulf 190 near Cologne. The German pilot, probably on one of his first missions, made the fatal mistake of attacking head-on. Sergeant Mike Murphy from Boston, manning the nose guns, immediately opened fire. The B-25's 12.50 caliber guns tore into the Focke-Wulf with deadly precision. Within seconds, the German fighter was reduced to a flaming wreck, crashing to the ground in a fiery explosion. It was the last air-to-air kill by a B-25 gunship in the European theater. As the war in Europe drew to a close, the B-25 gunships had become an iconic symbol of American industrial might, their reputation for firepower unmatched. The planes had shifted from being hunted to becoming predators in their own right, and their legend would live on long after the war. The gunship B-25s were a testament to the power of innovation, proving that even a bomber could be transformed into a weapon that no fighter dared challenge. Captain Paul Anderson from Minnesota, who had flown 37 missions in a gunship Mitchell, shared his thoughts in a letter to his wife. "We changed the rules," he wrote. "For 3 years, fighters hunted bombers. We were always on the defensive, always reacting. Then we put 12 guns in the nose, and suddenly we weren't prey anymore. We were dangerous. We could reach out and touch them before they could touch us. You could see it in their eyes. Not that we could actually see their eyes, but you know what I mean. They'd come in all aggressive. Then they'd see our nose, see all those guns, and they'd hesitate. And in air combat, hesitation is death." Ground crews recognized the significance as well. Master Sergeant Roy White from Dallas, crew chief of Texas Thunder, had been working on bombers since 1942. Regular bombers, you're always patching holes, fixing damage from fighter attacks. But the gunships, they came back clean more often than not. The fighters just wouldn't engage them. And when they did, well, we'd be painting another kill mark on the nose instead of patching bullet holes. November 1944 brought new challenges as the Germans introduced the Me-262 jet fighters, which were 100 miles per hour faster than anything the Allies had. The conventional wisdom was that these jets were unstoppable, but the gunship crews weren't so sure. On November 28, 1944, they got their chance to prove it. Captain Jack Thompson from Denver was flying Colorado Crusher on a mission to bomb rail yards near Frankfurt when two Me-262s appeared. The jets made a high-speed pass of the formation, their cannons blazing. Most of the bombers could only watch, unable to track the fast-moving jets, but Thompson had positioned his B-25 perfectly, anticipating their attack path. Sergeant Pete Wilson from Portland, manning the nose guns, had 2 seconds to engage. With 12 guns, 2 seconds was all he needed. He led the target by what seemed like an impossible distance, firing where the jet would be rather than where it was. The wall of lead intersected perfectly with a Me-262 flight path. The jet flew through the concentrated fire for less than half a second, but that was enough. Multiple .50 caliber rounds struck the jet's right engine, and it began trailing smoke. The pilot broke off, diving away, trying to make it back to base on one engine. He didn't make it, bailing out 10 miles short of his airfield. It was the first jet fighter damaged by a B-25 gunship, showing that even the latest German wonder weapons couldn't stand up to concentrated firepower. The second Me-262 wisely decided not to press its attack, vanishing into the clouds at 600 miles per hour. Wilson received the Silver Star for his exceptional gunnery skills against superior enemy aircraft. In December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, German forces broke through American lines in the Ardennes, and every available aircraft was thrown into the battle. The B-25 gunships were assigned close air support missions. Their firepower was desperately needed to stop German armored columns flying in weather that usually grounded all aircraft. The Mitchells flew low through snow and fog, their 12 nose guns tearing into German vehicles and troops. On December 23rd, when the weather briefly cleared, the full might of Allied air power was unleashed. Captain Bill Roberts from Houston led 3 gunship Mitchells against a German panzer column near Bastogne. They flew in line astern, each B-25 firing its nose guns in sequence. The first Mitchell destroyed the lead vehicles, blocking the road. The second hit the fuel trucks in the middle of the column. Roberts, flying the third aircraft, worked over the trapped vehicles systematically. His nose gunner, Sergeant Jim Davis from Little Rock, fired over 4,000 rounds in 3 passes. By the end of the attack, 27 German vehicles were burning, and the column was completely destroyed. But the Germans fought back fiercely, with intense anti-aircraft fire. On Roberts' third pass, Houston Pride took heavy damage. The nose compartment was hit repeatedly. Davis was wounded in both arms but kept firing, and the right engine was shot out. The left wing was on fire. Roberts managed to keep the Mitchell airborne long enough to reach American lines before belly landing in a snow-covered field. The crew survived, but Davis would lose his left arm. Houston Pride was done. Another gunship lost to German desperation. By January 1945, the war in Europe was nearing its end. German resistance was collapsing, and their air force was nearly destroyed. The gunship B-25 had completed their mission, but the need for their specialized firepower had faded. Some gunships were converted back to standard bomber configurations, while others were reassigned to ground attack duties. On February 12, 1945, Brooklyn Brawler, flown by Lieutenant Sam Cohen from New York, encountered a lone Focke-Wulf 190 near Cologne. The German pilot, probably on one of his first missions, made the fatal mistake of attacking head-on. Sergeant Mike Murphy from Boston, manning the nose guns, immediately opened fire. The B-25's 12.50 caliber guns tore into the Focke-Wulf with deadly precision. Within seconds, the German fighter was reduced to a flaming wreck, crashing to the ground in a fiery explosion. It was the last air-to-air kill by a B-25 gunship in the European theater. As the war in Europe drew to a close, the B-25 gunships had proven their worth. While their role had been small in the grand scheme of things, it was significant to those who flew and fought in them. Of the 42 B-25Js converted to gunship configuration in the European theater, 31 survived the war. They accounted for at least 73 confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed, probably twice that number damaged, and countless vehicles, trains, and ground targets obliterated by their tremendous firepower. The crews returned to America, to places like Detroit, Denver, Boston, and Birmingham, some of them flying again in Korea, others never setting foot in an aircraft again. They carried with them memories of that incredible firepower, the 12 guns roaring in unison, creating a wall of lead that terrified enemy fighters. The aircraft themselves met various fates. Some were scrapped, their war-weary frames no longer worth maintaining. Others were converted into trainers or transports, while a few ended up in museums. Seattle Slugger now sits in a museum in Washington state, its nose gun still pointed forward, still looking dangerous even in peaceful retirement. In a 1962 interview, former Major Klaus Steinberg, the pilot who had been shot down by a gunship Mitchell in 1944, recalled, "We laughed when we first heard about them. Bombers with 12 machine guns in the nose. It seemed like American excess, like putting too much chrome on a car. Then I encountered one. The air in front of that bomber turned solid with lead. It was like flying into a wall. I'd faced Spitfires, Thunderbolts, Mustangs. Nothing compared to those B-25s with solid noses. They didn't just defend themselves. They attacked you with defensive fire. It was brilliant and terrifying." The legacy of the gunship B-25s extended beyond their combat record. They proved that innovation could overcome traditional limitations, that defensive weapons could become offensive tools, and that the bomber-fighter dynamic wasn't fixed. They influenced post-war aircraft design, leading to heavily armed gunships like the AC-47 and AC-130 that would dominate the battlefields in Vietnam and beyond. But perhaps their greatest legacy was in the minds of the men who flew them. They had gone to war expecting to be hunted, to be victims needing protection. Instead, they became hunters themselves, predators in bombers' clothing. They took 12.50 caliber machine guns and turned them into a psychological weapon as powerful as any bomb. Technical Sergeant Joe Novak, the flight engineer from El Paso who kept those 12 guns running, said it best in a letter to his son years later. "We didn't just fight the Germans. We fought fear itself. Every time those 12 guns opened up, creating that wall of lead, we were saying, 'We're not afraid of you. You should be afraid of us.'" And they were. My God, they were. The numbers tell one story. 42 aircraft modified, 73 confirmed kills, hundreds of ground targets destroyed, thousands of rounds fired. But the real story was in those moments when German pilots saw that solid nose, saw those 12 dark holes, and decided to find easier prey. The real victory was in making the hunters hesitate, in turning defense into offense, and in proving that American ingenuity could take any challenge and turn it into an advantage. Today, only a handful of B-25 gunships survive in museums around the world. Visitors walk past them, maybe read a placard about their armament, take a photo. Few understand what those 12 guns meant, what that solid nose represented. It wasn't just firepower. It was defiance. It was American crews saying, "Come at us. We're ready." The last surviving nose gunner from the gunship Mitchells, Mike Murphy from Boston, died in 2019 at age 94. At his funeral, his grandson read from his diary, "They gave us 12 guns and told us to defend ourselves. We did more than that. We made the Germans defend themselves from us. Every time I squeezed that trigger, sending 20 pounds of lead per second into the sky, I was writing a message in tracers. American bombers aren't victims. Not anymore. Not with these guns. Not with these crews. We changed the game, and the Germans never recovered from that change."